I say this with all sincerity. You little piggies better like this episode because since day one, you have messaged me wanting a fucking John Brown episode. You are going to walk away from this episode feeling like you were there in Bleeding Kansas with John Brown. You are going to feel like you were there witnessing him lop off the heads of slavers in Kansas. You're going to feel like you were there at Harper's Ferry with him to the very end.
Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland, 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 Dixieland.
All right, y'all. Thank you for tuning in to Dixieland the Proletariat. We're going to talk about Southern working class history and current events through a leftist perspective. Make sure to like us on social media at Dixieland the Proletariat or find all of our links at our link tree. That's linktree/.prol, DOT-prol, where if you want to give your wages to a bunch of rednecks, you'll find a link to our Patreon. We got a lot of cool stuff to give you, including CDs, stickers, a cookbook, Discord server, and exclusive episodes. We also have a Spotify playlist with some great artists you also check out, as well as our merch store. This podcast is brought to you by Contractional Monogamy, not being able to afford therapy, living at home, beta blockers, Kaiser pushing white men in the swamps, Nelson's love life, Tyler's hiatus, Mark's laughter, which brings joy to the masses, the Kansas Board of Tourism, and FEMA. Shout out to our new Patreon subscribers, Tyler. Second vote for Huntsville, Alabama live show. Just a side note, we will never, ever do a live show. Jeremiah, Sean, a.k.a. Waffle Titty. That's literally what the thing is. So anyway, our intro music is by Psychotic Refuge. Our producer is Mr. Speaker. Our monthly surplus goes to groups that are run by and or help marginalized people directly. As always, I'm Nelson with...
I don't even know how to follow that. The opening is so fucking long now.
I know, right?
The other half of Mr. Speaker, I guess.
Yeah.
That's me.
And Mark.
Why you gotta do this to me every time?
So great. And Mark. And our guest this evening, back for a second time, the world famous
Chris. And I don't know about world famous, but I tried my best. Thanks for having me back. And,
you are world
always
famous.
a pleasure.
You're a world traveler now. You got to meet famous people. You got like you're blowing up on all the social media. You're like America's number one teacher.
Oh, come on now. I'm happy to have that ranking, I hope I hold that title strong and wear it like a badge of honor. But yeah, I am a teacher and an author, PhD student who just loves history, and I love this podcast. So thanks for having me.
Oh, stop.
Nah.
Our listeners may recognize Chris from our episode on the myth of the lost cause, but Chris is back because, and I say this with all sincerity, you little piggies better like this episode because since day one, you have messaged me wanting a fucking John Brown episode. So I reached out and I thought, who would be the best person I know to do a John Brown episode? And lo and behold, coming down from the sun like John Brown's broadsword against the head of a slaver, the one and only Chris is going to give us the best John Brown episode anyone has ever done. And I am fully confident that this is going to be amazing. You are going to walk away from this episode feeling like you were there in Bleeding Kansas with John Brown. You are going to feel like you were there witnessing him lop off the heads of slavers in Kansas. You're going to feel like you were there at Harper's Ferry with him to the very end. And you're going to feel great. So without further ado, because I know we got a lot to talk about, Chris, please tell us about the man, the myth, the legend, the last time God ever spoke to someone and they actually did the right thing, John Brown.
Oof, quite the intro. I hope I could live up to this. The best John Brown episode ever. I am a huge fanatic. Like, I'm a fan of this guy. He absolutely fascinates me. And I'm not even kidding. I'm mesmerized by him. I read all the books. I watch the lectures and stuff. And And I just think he's absolutely incredible. And like you said, yeah, he really believed he had God on his side, which usually when people say that, sometimes it's not always the best. But John Brown, it was the best. But before we get to Bleeding Kansas, and if any of the listeners know, they already know what happens there. I think it's crucial to start off with John Brown's dad. For some reason, this dude like never gets any attention, but his pops, a guy by the name of Owen Brown, he lived this kind of lifestyle where he believed in hard work. His dad died when he was 8 from the Revolutionary War. So John Brown's grandfather fought in the Revolutionary War. This guy was like a cattle breeder. He was a staunch and outspoken abolitionist. So John Brown got a lot from his dad in terms of his abolitionist views. But Owen Brown was also a Calvinist. And if you know anything about Calvinists, they believe in what we call predestination. So he sort of believed himself to be this guy where everyone was already predetermined, like they were predestined to go to heaven or hell. And he believed that enslavers automatically go into hell. So when John Brown does this thing later in life, you know, he's just sending them to the hell he believes they're already going to, just a lot quicker. So John Brown was raised on this Old Testament kind of vengeful justice, the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and you really see it play out throughout his life. There were some monumental things that happened in his childhood. At age 12, he witnessed a horrific beating of an enslaved kid, and that really, really shook him. And as you said, he wanted to be a religious figure, so he wanted to be a minister, and he went to school to actually be a preacher, to study theology, but he ran out of money, which is kind of odd because one of the reasons he didn't become a minister was he went broke, and that's what led him to his path. There are so many interesting things that are said about him that it's just kind of hard to get your finger, but apparently he did have a massive ego, and apparently he thought of himself as like, as you can imagine what he tries to do. He like said what he said and he meant it. He thought of himself as like the king around people, and he had these really firm convictions, and he truly believed he had God on his side. And also while he was growing up, there were other things to put into context that was happening. Slavery was actually increasing in the 1800s. People think that it was declining, but it was increasing tremendously due to the cotton gin, which made slavery more profitable than ever. He was also a product of this religious movement called the Second Great Awakening, where in the North, preachers in this movement, they actually would say things like slavery is bad, it's wrong, it's immoral, and it's against God. So this led to this sentiment that he was building all throughout his life of being an abolitionist. And at this time, most abolitionists were peaceful. They really believed that they were going to change things through legal means. They thought they could go through the process, the proper channels. Even when Nat Turner launched his rebellion in 1831, who also was a preacher and also believed God was on his side and inspired John Brown. But he launched this rebellion, which was one of the deadliest in the country. It wasn't as big as the 1811 German Coast Uprising in Louisiana, but this was a massive rebellion that terrified enslavers. The North and the South both condemned it. Even abolitionists were saying this was not the way. So violent abolitionism was not popular at the time. And so John Brown was raised in this kind of area where there's a growing religious movement, which Calvinists are a huge part of. There's a booming abolitionist movement, which advocated for peace and nonviolence. By booming, I mean it was pretty substantial, but the majority of white people north and the south actually weren't even a part of it. Sometimes I think it's exaggerated, but there was an abolitionist movement. And for most of his life, he was an abolitionist, but he was always broke. He was always trying to stay afloat. He was in debt. He was facing lawsuits. He was constantly moving, trying to get away from people collecting debts. So his father was a super successful businessman, and John Brown was apparently always broke. He tried over 20 different occupations, like a plethora of different jobs, from land speculation to selling wool, and he just kept declaring bankruptcy, and all of his 20 plans, they would all fail miserably. So he did carry out one duty, though. He believed that it was his biblical duty to be fruitful and multiply. So he had over 21 kids with 2 different women. And None of them didn't make it out of infancy. But I've also read that he had so many kids because he wanted to raise abolitionists. Like he wanted them to fight for him against slavery. So he was having all of these kids and naming them after famous abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and whatnot. So he did believe that he should be fruitful and multiply. And he also apparently raised his kids with some super strict discipline. He thought of himself as, again, this godlike figure that if you did something wrong, it was fire and brimstone type Christianity. It wasn't anything nice. And by 18, and I think that's a precursor to the violence he would kind of engage in, because a lot of times that starts at home. By 1854, he was chased out of multiple states because of his rise in debts, and people were on the look for him. He even spent time in jail. Yeah, he was broke in many ways. So he decided to move to rural New York and start a farm. He also wanted to provide assistance to Black Americans who were establishing farms based on free labor out there, or free as in not enslaved. And he wanted to create communities like this all over the states. He had that vision. So like many abolitionists, he wanted to do things like that. He was somewhat peaceful. However, 1 year later in 1855, John Brown received a letter from 5 of his sons that changed his life forever. He was on his farm doing his thing, and a letter comes in, and essentially they're telling him 5 of his sons are in Kansas, and they're saying Kansas is awful. There's pro-slavery people everywhere. They're ransacking towns. They're killing abolitionists. They're taking over the state. And a little more context here. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which essentially nullified the Missouri Compromise. And this act allowed Kansas and Nebraska, these territories, to organize them into territories and allow them to vote on the issue of slavery. So when you allow a state like Kansas to vote on the issue of slavery, this is going to stoke tensions, national tensions, because pro-slavery forces from Missouri started pouring in, and they started forming militias. They call themselves the Border Ruffians, and they were incredibly violent. Then you also had abolitionists moving in, vying to pull the state towards the abolitionist cause, and free soilers. These are people that just didn't want to compete with enslavers, because a lot of poor whites, some yeoman farmers, might have never been able to compete with plantation slavery. So they were pouring in as well. And they started fighting with one another, and this became known as Bleeding Kansas. It's interesting, if you read some historians, they will say that the Civil War truly starts in Kansas. They're literally fighting one another over the issue of slavery. So these pro-slavery folks, they pour in from Missouri, and they form all of these militias. However, they're still not the majority of the population. So through violence and intimidation, as we see all throughout U.S. history, they cheated on votes, and then they started to establish their own state legislature. Well, obviously, the free soilers, the anti-slavery folks, were like, hey, you can't just like create a government out of thin air. And they set up their own legislature to compete with. So you essentially have Kansas with 2 different state governments, which at the time was kind of unheard of. During the Civil War, like Louisiana had 2 different governments for a period of time. But this, you have 2 governments competing with one another. What do you think is going to happen? Like, neither's going to budge. They're going to fight. It's going to escalate. People are going to get killed. So essentially, you had 2 different sides, and there was no middle or compromise. During this time, John Brown's in Kansas, and they send him a letter. They're struggling to get established. They're terrified of all these pro-slavery people. So amidst the chaos, guess who shows up with a wagon full of guns? I mean, talk about a powder keg waiting to happen. John Brown shows up, and he eventually creates his own anti-slavery militia. So essentially, John Brown has had enough of it. He decides he's going to war. He's going to, and he believes he's engaged in a holy war. Like he truly believes he's engaged in this act from God to end and completely get rid of slavery. So he heads to Kansas, starts his own anti-slavery militia. And then something happens that changes him, because he's kind of defensive on this point. On May 1st, 1856, there are over 300 pro-slavery forces that sack the city of Lawrence, Kansas. Now, Lawrence, Kansas was the center of anti-slavery activities. That was like the center for the anti-slavery movement. Their little state legislature was there. These pro-slavery forces, they destroyed all of the printing presses, essentially leaving the abolitionist movement without a way to advocate in the Senate. And this angers John Brown. It enrages him. He says, we have to do something because these people are sacking entire cities now. They're going to win. And again, enslavers are going to get even more power in the country, in the overall Congress. Literally one day later, by the name of Charles Sumner, an abolitionist senator, gives this speech in which he condemns South Carolina. He pretty much, he says the most, if you ever want to listen to a good speech or hear or read a good speech, like this guy goes in on enslavers and goes in on South Carolina, so much so that he offends all of these representatives from South Carolina, one of whom is super just offended by this speech, a representative by the name of Preston Brooks from South Carolina. He approaches Charles Sumner, this is in Congress, and takes out his cane and starts beating Sumner unconscious until essentially the cane breaks. So he is beating him as much as he could. Sumner falls unconscious and he keeps beating him. And everyone's like, all right, that's not a fight anymore. People try to break it up. And what a lot of people don't know about this event is that another representative was nearby and pulled out a gun and wouldn't let anyone break it up. So this is literally in the Senate chambers. A man is getting beat to almost death for defiling South Carolina. Charles Sumner survives hardly. He's bloody. He's beaten. So John Brown hears about the sacking of Lawrence. Charles Sumner beat to a bloody pulp. And this enrages him. I mean, he would write that the abolitionist movement, he would call them cowards. They can't stand up for themselves. And he was ranting and raving. He was upset. So John Brown and other violent abolitionists decided to take offensive action. And this is where the course of John Brown's life starts to change. Just north of Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, John Brown and his men go around to different homes and they pull people out, pro-slavery people. And these aren't just pro-slavery people. These are like pro-slavery militants, and some of them were slave hunters. And he pulls these people out. He gives them a quick, almost like a trial, to kind of figure out what they did and who they were. And then he makes the families of these people come out. And then he slowly hacks these people to death. I don't know how else to say it. I know it's a podcast or whatnot, but he literally, with swords and axes, they hack people in front of their families. Interestingly enough, John Brown actually let a few of them go because he determined that they were innocent. So he really believed he was given the vengeance of
based.
Of
all that is based. That is great.
Right?
The Punisher in the Civil War.
Imagine John Brown with like the Punisher logo on his shirt. You took everything from me.
Absolutely. I mean, he felt he was going to war. That's what I try to tell my students. He honestly felt he was going to war. And John Brown had this logic. If you read his writing, he would say things like, well, aren't we supposed to be brothers and sisters in Christ or something along those lines? Well, if you really believe that, then why are you not doing more about slavery? If you really believe these people are your brothers and sisters who are in bondage, then you should be, like, he would take things like that literal. And so if someone had a sibling that was in bondage, you would want to, wreak havoc. So that was kind of his mindset. And yeah, he really believed that God was telling him to conduct these killings. So based indeed, because when you think about it, I don't usually give my opinions to my students, but he really believed he was at war. And for all intents and purposes, Bleeding Kansas was a war, regardless if we call it a war. These two sides were opposing each other, and they were fighting this conflict. Now, I've had some students say that it might have been overboard to bring the families out and, have them watch it. Then I've had students say things like, well, they got to learn the hard way. Like, your pops wasn't in slavery, dude. I mean, what are you going to do? You have to, this is what your guy did. He was a slave hunter, pretty much. So, it's an interesting debate. It gets pretty heated. But what's funny about the debate now is the students all agree like it was okay for him to do it. It was just like, but what about the families? Is that okay? So that's the debate that they have. A lot has changed in my 10 plus years in education, because when I would first teach John Brown, I'd be like, well, I don't know. Is it going too far? And now everyone's like, well, not really, but the kids watching.
The kids are all right. We're gonna be okay. That's great.
Yeah, there's been some times in the last few years where I think there's been a paradigm shift in terms of how kids interpret history. And the fact that you're saying that people are asking for a John Brown podcast, I mean, it's everywhere. I feel like there's books, there's podcasts, it's all the rave, there's a resurgence. But when we were younger, I don't know how old you are, but when I was a kid, I don't remember hearing in high school about John Brown. And then a reference maybe in college. And that's what started this, me actually. And I think that's interesting. I think, we can get into what that means for us to hide history of white people doing shit like this. What that means for, our country when we don't know this history. But I got to get to some of the good parts, because it was, the best is yet to come, or maybe that was the best, depending on your perspective. So essentially, this led to a massive retaliatory events. Overall, Bleeding Kansas, the next 3 months after the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, as it became known, was just insane. Over 200 people would eventually die in Bleeding, Kansas, and John Brown became a national figure. He gained national fame for this massacre. However, he actually never admitted to this massacre, and apparently never really denied it either, and would never really mention it until people brought it up. But I was listening to an interesting lecture by David Blight, a Yale historian who has his own lecture on John Brown on YouTube. It's fascinating. And apparently when people would ask too many questions and he would admit to it in like private dinners, they would ask him to stop, because what he would describe would be so gruesome. So maybe they didn't want to know too many details. So I can't even imagine what was done, because they had guns, but there was a reason they chose not to use the guns. Very specific reason, in my opinion. So he gained fame, and he's going all around the country, and he's giving speeches. He's rallying support for this abolitionist cause, and people are coming to listen to him. Although he did make some white abolitionists nervous, he would go to these churches, and they would be clapping and whatnot. And then he would, raise his pistol up and say, "We need to fight with blood." And all of a sudden, they would be like, "Oh, well, do I have to? Can I just give you the money?" So he did cause a lot of discomfort. While he's giving the speeches, the historical context is vital here. In 1857, the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision was made, which essentially said that the Constitution was not meant to include citizenship for Black Americans, for people of African descent. It was a huge blow to the abolitionist cause. They were pouring money into this decision and hoping for the opposite effect. But obviously, as we know from recent events, the Supreme Court very rarely makes the right decision. I can literally think of sometimes, but a lot of times they made decisions like this, like the Dred Scott case. Also, James Buchanan just became president, who was pro-slavery and pro-states' rights. And this is on the verge of secession. So can you imagine a pro-states' rights president? Abolitionists, they were losing in all aspects of government. Legislatively, where the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, and then the Supreme Court, so they were losing the judicial with the Dred Scott decision. James Buchanan takes over the executive branch. So abolitionism is losing, and this has destroyed any attempts at compromise. Dred Scott and James Buchanan kind of put the nail in the coffin that this is going to be our country. John Brown said, no, it's not. This is not going to be our country. Right? Wait. I don't know if it's Nelson. I love your hand motions throughout. It's amazing. True Italian, no doubt.
Just like John Brown's like, whoa, allegedly I might have done some things here in Kansas. and then just like admits to it afterwards, and it's just it's great. No, I love it. I love it. It's just, and then the whole bit about making white people nervous. Who's like, hey, we gotta go fight with blood. It's just like something's never changed. It's just like now it's moved from that to like just getting people, I don't know, to mass protest or like do anything. Now it's just like, oh, we can, vote the problems away. Then you just mentioned with the Supreme Court, like, some things, it just never changes. It's just a cycle. But anyway, that's a whole nother rant for another day.
Oh, it's true. I think John Brown, he would use very different language, but he was so annoyed with white liberals of the day. He thought he literally used the word cowards multiple times. And he, would say their lives are too convenient to do anything, to be moved. Oh, it was fascinating. He would pretty much call them, like the modern version of keyboard warriors or something. So yeah, he was incredibly critical of liberals at the time. So as this was going on, John Brown started concocting a plan to end slavery once and for all. He wanted to ignite a slave rebellion, similar to what happened in Haiti. And he wanted to be the leader, of course, of the slave rebellion. And he felt that this was a holy war predestined by God. He thought he didn't have a choice. He had to do this if he was going to end slavery. And that was his life's goal. And he had to launch a revolution. It wasn't an option. This is what he had to do. This is what he was meant to do. So he started this plan, which is to this day, very secret. There's still a lot of details that are missing. And while he was planning this, he stayed at other abolitionists' homes, including the home of none other than Frederick Douglass. He stayed in Frederick Douglass's attic for over a month, and he drafted his own provisional constitution of Virginia, where, of course, he would be the governor after they overthrow the government of Virginia. And I find this piece fascinating because sometimes we think of Douglass as just being a peaceful abolitionist who gave speeches and wrote a lot of books and whatnot. But no way. He was literally hosting John Brown, who committed a deadly, gruesome massacre, and he was hosting the man. Like, Frederick Douglass was not a peaceful abolitionist by any means. He was literally hosting John Brown, as knowing full well that Brown was hacking folks to death in Virginia. They also went to battle in many different battles after that as well. But he's hosting pretty much a revolutionary who's drafting constitutions and planning to overthrow the government. Before doing this, of course, John Brown goes back to Kansas. He's not done there. And then he starts raiding into Missouri, actually taking a fight to enslavers in Missouri. He does this. They ransack plantations. They free 11 enslaved people. And then John Brown takes those 11 people who are now free. They get on trains and he brings them to Canada. By the time he got to Canada, there was 12 because a baby had been born. And the mother actually names the baby after John Brown. So he's literally, hosting his own underground railroad in his free time, like doing side quests, just going back to Kansas and, freeing people and bringing them to Canada. He comes back to Virginia, and obviously to carry out any successful revolution, you need weapons. Well, John Brown decides to steal over 100,000 guns from the federal government's arsenal at Harper's Ferry. This arsenal was strategically located in what is now West Virginia, Virginia. And I went here last summer. Well, actually last year, almost a year to the day, I actually went to Harper's Ferry and I retraced John Brown's last days. This revolution from start to finish. Talk about a history nerd, right? I know, I just did it. He tried to recruit Frederick Douglass, but Frederick Douglass called his plan suicidal, which is kind of true. You're going to take over a federal arsenal. Harriet Tubman was also recruited, but she didn't join him as well. So Brown, a few of his sons, and 21 men, they all formed this little militia. Their goal was to take over the arsenal at Harper's Ferry and then spread the word to enslaved people in the area all around Virginia what was transpiring. And they were going to rush to Harper's Ferry, and he was going to arm as many people as possible. And then they were going to go from Harper's Ferry and make their way to Richmond, overthrow Virginia's government, and place himself as the governor. A pretty gnarly plan, but a couple of things were missing. Again, It was very secretive. We don't know anything about it. Even when he was with Frederick Douglass, apparently he was hardly writing letters. And him and Frederick Douglass, apparently Frederick Douglass wrote him one letter, and it said, "Hey, come down to dinner. Dinner's ready." And that's the only correspondence we have between the two while he was at Frederick Douglass's house. So throughout all of this, he was ready to go. By this time, he grew a massive gray beard, and he enjoyed being compared to Moses. He felt himself as this, saint-like figure to deliver God's will to end slavery. So John Brown and his men, they cross over the Shenandoah River, and what they do is they seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry and take control over 100,000 guns. Oddly enough, there was only one person guarding the entire arsenal and armory. One person. So there wasn't much of a fuss. People didn't actually fight back too much. So here's John Brown sitting on 100,000 guns. He cut the telegraph lines, he blockaded the bridges, and he took hostages. I always found it interesting that one of the hostages is a man named Lewis Washington, who was the great grandnephew of George Washington. And he had apparently a really cool sword that John Brown took from him and just wielded around throughout this entire time. I love little details like that. So the first part of the plan went swimmingly. However, getting the word out to enslaved people proved to be a huge challenge. So the logistics apparently wasn't thought out too well. And divine intervention didn't really work as he anticipated. It was at this point, after they take over the ferry, Harper's Ferry, that they make a crucial error. One train was passing through, and a black man, a watchman named Hayward Shepherd, saw John Brown and people, and it was really, really late at night, super dark, and he went to alert people about the raid out of fear. And one of Brown's men didn't hesitate and actually murdered Hayward Shepherd. And Brown, before the train could leave, stopped the train, John Brown and some of his people, and detained the people on the train and spoke to them for over an hour. They didn't recognize that it was John Brown. However, John Brown let the train go. Later in his trial, he would say that night was his biggest mistake. And if you're unfamiliar, in Harper's Ferry, there's actually a statue of Hayward Shepherd that was built by the Daughters of the Confederacy. They erected this monument to promote the pseudo-historical lost cause myth that I talked about last time I was on here. And it inaccurately claims that Shepherd was opposed to abolitionism, which there's no truth to that. There's no record of that. And this monument was celebrated by the KKK. And it's still up in Harper's Ferry, by the way. Like, there's still Confederate and it didn't go up until 1931, like the height of Jim Crow. So Harper's Ferry, where John Brown made his last stand, this is the home of this awful, awful monument. Nonetheless, while word was getting out, a local militia took over the bridge and surrounded Brown's militia. One man, a guy by the name of Dangerfield Newby, who was a black man who joined John Brown, he was the first to be killed, and Newby joined to help his enslaved wife gain freedom. That's why he joined. It was this really romantic story. He even had a letter from his wife in his pocket when he was killed. Of course, the militia, as awful as people are, and within kind of American tradition, they cut off his ears as a trophy, and they dumped his river in the body to send a message to John Brown. So at this point, the militia starts closing in. They're shooting from the mountains. It's kind of like a valley. And John Brown and his men retreat to this one little fort. It's a little building. It's called John Brown's Fort. It's still there today, by the way. You can check it out. It's a fascinating spot. President James Buchanan is not happy about this, so he sends in the Marines. And I think you remember, Nelson, who was leading these Marines.
Boo! Everyone's least favorite horse fornicator.
Exactly.
Colonel Robert E. Lee. At this time, he was a colonel.
Yep. Robert E. Lee.
And to remind everyone, Robert E. Lee had sexual relations with his horse traveler. That is a fact.
So who's your favorite horse fornicator, Nelson? if he's your least.
Shut up, Mark. There's a video that's on the internet that we've all seen. Anyway,
Speak for yourself.
Anyway, Robert E. Lee, horrible individual. I don't care what anyone says. We talked about that in the other episode, but yeah, Robert E. Lee sucks.
I mean, he was just awful. There's like, I can't think of someone that's done almost everything wrong in U.S. history, and Robert E. Lee was that guy. He was the guy they sent to put down John Brown's revolution. So I'm always bitter when I think of Robert E. Lee. I think of all these different things that he did. Like people would write about the way he treated people he enslaved. He was just a brutal tyrant of a person who made a very specific choice to side with Virginia instead of his own country. So James Buchanan sends in the Marines, and these people are led by Robert E. Lee. And since Brown's ragtag army had hostages, the Marines didn't want to, just open fire right away. Instead, they used battering rams to puncture a hole in the doors for Marines to crawl in. And the first door that gets punctured is only small enough for one man to crawl in. And so the first Marine that goes in is ready to be the hero, to kill John Brown, to destroy the revolution forever. However, he takes his bayonet to stab John Brown. That's kind of dark. And as he does, he hits John Brown's belt buckle. And I find this fascinating because the bayonet, the sword at the end of the gun, it curves, it bends, and John Brown doesn't die. And so it looks like this almost sort of divine act where John Brown, instead of getting killed, the bayonet bends and John Brown doesn't die. And so I could imagine people being like, dang, this guy really does have God on his side. Like the whole military's here. This guy goes to stab him and his bayonet bends. And Brown himself thought it was a sign from God. Like, look at me, I'm here and this is what's going on. So Brown was eventually captured alive because of this. Other people died. One of John Brown's sons actually died in this Harper's Ferry raid. So needless to say, Harper's Ferry raid was unsuccessful. They don't overthrow the government of Virginia. They don't launch an insurrection. They don't complete the goals. So John Brown has failed in his mission. I'm going to get to why that's debated later. So John Brown goes to trial, and it becomes the world's most sensational trial. Newspapers are writing about it. It's absolutely wild. And Brown, they tried to give him a lawyer. He didn't want a lawyer, and people who wanted to represent him, they tried to paint him as insane, as clinically insane. Like this guy actually thought he was going to overthrow the U.S. government with 21 people and take over the arsenal. But Brown himself rejected this, and he would state over and over that he's not insane. He's not crazy. He's not, has no mental issues or anything like that, that he was incredibly sane. And in his mind, the people that were insane and crazy were the enslavers. Those are the people that he felt were like that. And Brown's trial was fascinating. It was a national story, and he had the spotlight. So there were whispers that he was going to be rescued, and people were going to, try to save him. And these rumors were taken seriously because there were thousands of troops throughout the county that he was put in. I think it was Jefferson County or something like that. And they even put cannons around the courthouse. So when they would take him from the jail to the courthouse in this month or so long trial, he was guarded pretty heavily. And the entire county was under martial law. And there were attempts to save him. One of his buddies came from Kansas and went to Virginia and pretended to get drunk and start this huge drunken brawl at a bar to purposefully get arrested so he can see John Brown in prison. And so he sees John Brown in prison and he's like, perfect, man, let's go. Like, let's get out of here. Like, let's launch a rescue. And John Brown refused any help. He told him no, he'd rather die as a martyr, and that would be his advantage, than escape and be a fugitive. And he was using the sensationalism of the trial to get his message across. He was eventually declared guilty on 3 charges: murder, inciting slave insurrection, and treason. And he happily accepted that. And he gave a lot of speeches, and the speech he gave after he was declared guilty is rather fascinating. And there's one quote from the speech that has always stuck out with me because it rings so true today. Here's a quote from one of his last speeches in the courthouse. Had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or in behalf of any of their friends, either father, mother, brother, sister, wife, or children, or any of that class, and suffered and sacrificed what I have in this interference, it would have been all right, and every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. And I found that absolutely fascinating. He had a class consciousness. He knew that acting on the behalf of people who were not wealthy was going to lead him to a death sentence. And I think that, this is before the huge, socialist movements of the late 1800s and early 1900s across the U.S. And so I feel like John Brown was somewhat of a precursor to so many movements that came. And he really inspired a lot of people during his trial. Even Victor Hugo, the famed French romantic writer who wrote Hunchback of Notre Dame, he wrote to pardon John Brown. And he wrote these beautiful letters to try to get him pardoned. However, John Brown, while waiting for his execution, he made it clear in his letters and his conversations that these were the happiest days of his life and that he was going to be a martyr for his cause. If any of your readers, if you ever get bored, just look up John Brown's letters from the ones that he wrote from prison. He wrote hundreds of eloquent reply letters to all of his fans. He wrote to newspapers, to any outlet that he could. And they're just fascinating because he was so joyous. His writing in jail, he was happier than his writing before he was in prison. He even wrote one to his wife that essentially said, I'm going to paraphrase here, but you can look this up, that essentially said he couldn't wait to get hanged, that it was all worth it for those few minutes of being hanged, and he could not wait for it. Imagine getting that love letter as his wife, knowing your husband's super excited about his own execution. I can't even imagine. Apparently, he was so charismatic that he even won over his jailer and other guards. They were like, wow, this guy's pretty all right. He makes sense. And so when he was on his way to his execution, they transported him into his own coffin, by the way, to his execution. He apparently was happy. And he wrote these famous last words. These are the last words that John Brown ever uttered or wrote. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. Essentially predicting the Civil War. So over 3,000 soldiers surrounded his gallows to ensure that there were going to be no rescue attempts whatsoever. And I find it fascinating that one person was there who dressed up as a soldier to watch his execution, a man by the name of John Wilkes Booth, who watched and wrote later, I looked at the terror and he said, I looked at the traitor and the terrorizer with unlimited, undeniable contempt. And of course, we know Booth was a Confederate sympathizer who would later go on to assassinate President Lincoln. So he inspired a lot of people. In that case, John Wilkes Booth hated John Brown. After his execution in 1859, Southern states were terrified. They seriously thought that rebellions were just going to miraculously start popping up everywhere. And they started mobilizing. They were getting more weapons. They were cracking down as much as they can. And they were militarizing to protect slavery. And then, less than a year, Lincoln, a Republican, remember the Republican Party at the time, was then founded as a party to stop the spread of slavery. A lot has changed. I've done some Twitter threads and TikTok videos on how the Republican Party has changed. But they were originally their original goal was to stop the spread of slavery. So Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, was elected despite not being on one single ballot in the South, which shows just how much the Southern power has waned, because they were obviously a much more agricultural society. A large portion of the population wasn't even allowed to vote. The North, much more industrious, a much larger population, 23 million or so at this point. And Lincoln becomes a president, and the South knows that slavery, at least is not going to be able to spread as much as they want. Because for a long time, Southern enslavers had most of the power in the country. With the Three-Fifths Compromise, they had disproportionate representation because everyone that was enslaved, every 5 people who were enslaved were only counted as 3 persons. That was a compromise needed to get the Constitution to be signed. So they owned so much of this federal government, and most of the presidents that came before the Civil War were from the South. However, their power was waning. John Brown launches this revolution. They get terrified. Abraham Lincoln becomes president, and the South finally secedes in an attempt to preserve slavery. So they form the Confederacy, a rogue state. This Confederacy, as we all know, would lose miserably. We do get to rewrite history, and we talk about that. But I've read some interesting cases. Some historians, they claim that Brown actually knew his raid would fail, but he did it anyway to pit the South against the North and actually launch a civil war. So if this was the case, the man was playing 3D chess or something, that would be a wild plan to concoct to launch a civil war. Because, I mean, he had to have known his plan would fail, right? He had to have known that there wasn't going to be a real, or maybe he didn't know that. Maybe he really thought that it was going to. I still don't know, because some of the details are still murky on his actual plan. But he had to have known at least it was going to be incredibly hard to launch this insurrection with just 21 men. But he was also a means can justify the ends type of guy, so it does give it pause. Did he do this knowing he would fail and eventually launch the Civil War that later came? So John Brown, where do we go? His legacy is absolutely fascinating. After his death, his voice became essentially more powerful than his rifle. All of these abolitionist churches were gathering, they were ringing bells in the morning. Enslavers across the South became even more enraged and terrified of more John Browns. And then during the Civil War, of course, we all know Union troops sang John Brown's Body, which became later the battle hymn of the Republic, which has gained international fame. I was in Amsterdam this summer and someone was playing John Brown's Body, literally like in the main square in Amsterdam. Yeah, I couldn't believe it. I have it on video. Henry David Thoreau, who was this transcendentalist and nonviolent, pretty much as nonviolent as they come, he wrote that Brown's actions even challenged his own views on nonviolence. And this is Henry David Thoreau. If you know anything about this guy, he wrote that nonviolence was, the way to go. Ralph Waldo Emerson also said, quote, that John Brown was the rarest of heroes, a pure idealist with no buy-ins. And Frederick Douglass once famously said, quote, I could live for the slave, John Brown could die for him. Also, after John Brown's raid, it should be noted that Frederick Douglass hurried up and left and went to Canada because the government was going after all the abolitionists that helped them. And the day after Frederick Douglass left to go to Canada, federal troops arrived at his house to arrest him. So he just missed getting arrested by one day. History could have been very different had Frederick Douglass been forced to spend, his life in jail. And Harriet Tubman would say some really fascinating things about John Brown. He called him the greatest white man to ever have lived. And she said things like, John Brown himself did way more to end slavery than Lincoln. Set in motion the Civil War. Lincoln was just a product of the time and what was going on. But it was John Brown's actions who really got it going. And I think Malcolm X had the most interesting take. A quote from Malcolm X. If a white man wants to be your ally, what does he think of John Brown? You know what John Brown did? He went to war. He was a white man who went to war against white people to help free slaves. And he goes on to say things like, if you ever want to know, if a white person's actually down for the cause, you ask them their thoughts on John Brown. And if they say things, he was a nut job, he was crazy, then you know that these people aren't really down to help out. So John Brown has been called everything from terrorist to hero. There's been so many books written about them. One of the best is by W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote John Brown, a biography. There's another book called John Brown, Abolitionist by David S. Reynolds. Really fascinating. Also, David Blight, I mentioned earlier, a Yale professor who gives a lecture called John Brown's Holy War. So regardless of your views, I always tell my students, regardless of your views of John Brown, I mean, his impact was undeniable. And it is a shame that John Brown has been, for so long, has been buried throughout history. Now, not for everybody, of course, because Black churches across the South always mentioned John Brown in sermons and different traditions and whatnot. But in actual curriculum across the states, John Brown has in many ways been taken away. And it's just now that people are starting to know more about him. They're instilling more about him in the curriculum. And there's kind of been this revitalization as of late. And I think the summer of 2020 changed that a lot. So there's so much more to be said about John Brown. But yeah, I'm happy to discuss it. It's just a fascinating person who essentially believed that he was hearing voices from God to launch a revolution to abolish slavery. I mean, every time people hear voices from God, it's usually nothing, not the best.
I really think John Brown was the only time God spoke to said that God spoke to a white man and he actually did the right thing. Like, it's like, oh man, I didn't know that about him and all the family. The beginning, the description, he's kind of like a bum. And he's just like he's just kind of like be bopping around, not really doing anything. And then he just like always has this conviction, always wants, like, knows that slavery is bad. And finally, like, Kansas pops off and he's like, all right, this is my calling. It's just, that the thing about the kids, I get so many fucking kids. Lord.
21 that we know of.
He is a nut. I think he legitimately was insane, but he was right and he did a good thing. I think I 100% support John Brown's actions. Does that mean that he wasn't? Yeah, the man was batshit crazy, but he was great. And I think he's awesome. So it's kind of like, it's the best of both worlds. Yeah,
you can be both, right?
He's great. Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, you can be both, and it doesn't have to be either or. I just find it fascinating because you're right. He had so many failed business endeavors, and he didn't really get, super radical or violent until he was well older, until he was like in his 50s and stuff. He was essentially, they call him old man, John Brown. He was an older guy. And yeah, it's very rare you see like super old white people that hear voices from God that are like, all right, it's wartime to help other people now. It's usually the exact opposite.
We need God to start speaking that way again to people, not this bad way.
Just take my warning for a second here. I would say that this man's personality, the way that it's coming across in his early life, the amount of kids he had, his religious conviction, his personal conviction as things go on, if you use that kind of, I would say that he had almost a cult of personality, and that you could turn this kind of person into a cult leader like that.
Oh yeah.
This is somebody with so much charisma and so much drive that it's lucky that this person wasn't trying to like...
I got it. There's a very thin line between John Brown and Jim Jones.
Yes, exactly. I'm getting that exact
literally feeling, no, if you really
Jim Jones really went the route of a lot of drugs and that kind of cult of personality and pulling people into his circle to feed himself his own delusions, his own grandeur, and all of this stuff. With John Brown, I could see little like pinpricks of that, and that could be explained by the context of the time, and a lot of times where I'm thinking of a selfless leader, if they throw themselves into some place to take over the government, they might not think of automatically putting themselves into that leadership position. Like, there's little tiny pinpricks of it, but there could be context that explains why he would have been the best one for other reasons, rather than like, obviously my ideas are going to be the best one.
If you like Venn diagram Jim Jones and like John Brown, there's like you said, there's a lot of there's some overlap. It's like they're both pastors. They're both like Jim Jones in words only. Well, and to an extent, the early days of the People's Church
tried like some good things at some point.
And then he just completely off the rails. Yeah. It just completely just that they both reached that point and that like their like derangement to like, what are we gonna do? And John Brown was like, I'm gonna help people like through this way. Jim Jones was like, I'm gonna kill people. It's just oh my God.
But it's like the comparison, and I never thought about it as John Brown. What if he did put his sights in evil ways as opposed to this? I think we would have a much different country.
You because as he said, a lot of cult leaders.
Yeah.
Right. If he intervened on the other behalf, on the enslavers, you never know like what could have eventually transpired. Like if he thought of himself.
You could say like with his final words, like he's like, if I would have like if that so let's like John then like evil John Brown. If evil John Brown would have done what you just said, he basically it echoes like what would have like in his last words. He's like he would have been seen as a hero if he was pro-slavery, if he did all this, he probably wouldn't have been executed. He would have been a Confederate general. He probably would have seen his name up there with Lee and Jackson and Hood and all those jackasses.
I don't think you even have to go as far as saying like, what if he intervened on the behalf of keeping slavery a thing and all that. I think all that it takes is somebody who had the good ideas. Like you can follow Jim Jones very closely on this. Somebody who had fairly good ideas in the first place, did not succeed in many of his other pursuits. Jim Jones was kind of a bum to begin with.
Holy shit. What if Jim Jones is the reincarnation of John Brown and just went the other way?
The thing is that Jim Jones, like, oh God, how would I explain this? If Jim Jones, who was doing things to kind of facilitate racial justice and racial mixing in his churches early on, so take the government decides this is a bad thing, they lock him up during that early part of it. If you put Jim Jones in that same position to be put into a trial afterwards where he has the chance to be a martyr, to talk about his convictions, you could have ended up with the exact same thing. And for people who really love John Brown, and I'm not saying like, yeah, this man was obviously a nut and he would have done all these awful things, but like he never got to the point where the amount of power that he could have corrupted it, or his decisions were starting to be made poorly for the fact that he was the one who was solely in charge, et cetera, which is where you get things like cults, because they stop the amount of information coming in. They stop anybody from challenging the leadership. That's what I mean about like automatically thinking like, oh yeah, he should be put into the top levels of leadership at the end. Like, I don't know if this is just me, like being a psychology student and two being kind of a little awkward about really praising a white man.
Chris is like, should I get my tattoo covered up?
No, it's a fascinating story. I'm just saying, like, there's somebody who has that kind of personality, it really draws so much to them. It's a powder keg at the end of the day.
Yeah. It's just like it seems from what he said he was doing it for other people, but Kai, you really just made me stop to think of like, was he doing it just for himself, like just to fulfill this like what's that, delusions of grandeur? It sounds like he has a lot of those too, like this like I am bigger than I am the big other, like I am the savior, I'm just this God complex. You're right, cult of personality. And I think that Kai, you hit the nail on the head. I think he died before it could have gotten completely fucking out of hand. But it all of it does go back to the point that like it focuses on like his goal was good in the fact that he wanted to end slavery, but it's just like which goes back to all that. There's a very thin line between a John Brown and a Jim Jones. It's like either one could have easily crossed over to that other side. And if evil John Brown, to me, sounds absolutely horrifying. And I'm really glad that there was an evil John Brown. It was just good John Brown.
I was just about to say, the idea of an evil John Brown is terrifying. If someone has that much conviction and that much power and clout and they go off the rails and do something like Jim Jones, I can't imagine what havoc John Brown would have wreaked. But I'm so glad that he did not go that way. And I think it's interesting, like you mentioned delusions of grandeur. I completely agree. I think John Brown truly saw himself as a Moses-like figure, as some sort of messiah and whatnot. And so some discussions we have in my class are things like, as Kai was saying, should we even be praising a white man for doing something like this? Or did he have a white savior complex? And people bring in different conversations. I have some students that said, well, no, he collaborated with people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. He wasn't saying that he was going to, do everything for other people. He was working with some of the most notable abolitionists of the time. And other students will say, well, no, he definitely thought of himself, as a white savior for trying to launch this revolution anyway, knowing full well that it was essentially going to be suicidal. So it brings up some very interesting debates, and also about whether he was really crazy or not. I have some students that would say he was not crazy. He was very sane, and he just knew what needed to be done and what should be done. And so I always go back and forth with my true feelings about John Brown's intentions, because his impact is undeniable, and I always say that. But his intentions, I find absolutely the psychology of John Brown. And I'm not a psychologist. I have a minor in psychology, but I'm not an expert. But I think it's one of the most fascinating historical figures in the U.S. That psychology, that mindset.
There's really funny status from the other Chris, Black Red Guard, that came on. He was like, if John Brown was alive today, y'all would be calling him an adventurist and like all this other stuff, and it would just be this big argument to be like, what was about John Brown? But like, I'm so glad John Brown's not. like I can imagine the discourse around if John Brown was like active today, it would be a complete and utter fucking clusterfuck. I think personally he was insane. I think that hacking slave owners and pro-slavery people in front of their families is hella based. I think that's fucking great. That's the Italian in me. Fucking do it. Kill the entire family. That would have been great too. The Harper's Ferry raid. You brought up an interesting question about, did he think that it was gonna fail? And the only reason I would say I honestly think that he thought that it was gonna work was because what he said about the train. Like, why would you say that the train and letting it go was such a big mistake if you were like, no, this is just a suicide mission from day one? It wouldn't have mattered. But like, I really think that if, from what we know, obviously, like you said, there's lost stuff. If the train was his biggest mistake and letting it go, then that sounds to me that he thought that it was actually going to work. Now, whether he's in like a sound mind and it was like, this is going to work, or like really whatever he thought. I think he thought that it was actually going to work. And I think when he says that thing about letting the train go, I think that kind of shows that in his mind, he thought this was actually going to work and he was going to be the king of Virginia.
I agree with you. I think that he thought it was going to work as well. I just, when I hear the arguments that some historians say that they knew that he thought it wasn't going to work and that he was going to launch the Civil War. Again, if he was really thinking that, he would be playing some sort of like 3D chess game. And we're all over here like over 100 years, 50 years later or so, like, whoa, he really, duped all of us. And, so I agree with you. And sometimes I do think historians, I don't want to be guilty of this, because I love learning about people in the past. I think sometimes they glorify people and give them so much more weight than it's deserved. Like, you're probably right. John Brown was like, this is going to be amazing. I'm going to be the governor of Virginia. We're going to launch this insurrection. We're going to set a model, and then slave revolt's going to happen all across the South, and we're going to do away with slavery once and for all. And the federal government's going to have no choice whatsoever but to adhere to our demands and abolish slavery. So I really thought that was his end game. And I do think some historians they might give him a little too much credit to say that he was like, no, ends justify the means. So yeah, I think that makes sense.
How many people accompanied him on the Harper's Ferry raid? How many people were there with him?
From what I remember, 21 people total.
Okay.
And a few of them were his kids.
So there's something that you have to consider with that if you're going to go into his state of mind and his intentions at that point. If he thinks that he's going on a suicide raid, he could have told the people who were going with him that this is a suicide raid and you guys should be prepared for that as well. Or in a more sinister light, he was prepared for a suicide raid and didn't prepare the people who were with him for that. In which case you have like the spider web of intentions when you come down to that. And that's one of the things that I want people who talk about history and talk about historical figures to remember. Like, I'm not a historian, I did not go to school for this, but I want everybody to remember, think about the people who are around these historical figures, that they are going to be the ones, like, maybe John Brown didn't write a letter about this so that there's a historical document of it, but he's probably talking physically to some person or another who knows a bit more about this. Did he sit down with possibly 21 people, including 2 of his sons, and said, this is likely a suicide raid, are all of you prepared to die for this cause, probably being either imprisoned or taken out by people coming to fight against us? You can't think of like 150 years ago and say like, well, this is definitely this person's intentions, but you can get a better idea by thinking about the people who are around them, at least.
Out of everything I've read about John Brown, I've been fascinated with him for some time. There's no mention of him saying that this is going to be a suicide mission or something. Like, from what I've read, it seems like he really believed it, but he did tell people going in, like, you got to be prepared to die. Like, we're going to war. But also, you're right. If he really thought of it as a suicide mission just to start a civil war, then he would be such a means justify the ends that he wouldn't even care to sacrifice his own sons or like people who liberated themselves, like Dangerfield Newby, who went in there with the hopes of eventually freeing his wife. Exactly. So John Brown would have had to been, then he would have really been really cruel to use people as pawns in that way. So you got me convinced. I think now that y'all are right, I think some of those historians might have overplayed John Brown or over.
Yeah. You kind of mythologize, like, not you personally, but the general, you mythologize somebody so much that you think like they had this figured out 5 steps ahead, which would have entailed horrible conversations, unthinkable cruelty, like things like this, that maybe somebody who had a good idea started to enact it and it just went awry, as plans tend to go.
Kai, 100%, you hit the nail on the head. You're 2 for 2. Nail on the head. And Chris, y'all all probably agree that there are historical figures that we have completely mythologized, that we think, oh, they're like galaxy brain, 3D chess. They really knew. No, they just were in the right place at the right time and took advantage of an opportunity and did something. Like it literally, and you see this a lot with people who unfortunately look like me, that really like war history, and they're like, oh, Patton was the great, or they'll be like, Patton was the greatest fucking general ever. I'm like, no, man was batshit fucking crazy. He just didn't give a fuck. He was insane. He wasn't God. And it's like, or Rommel. Then those people are fucking weird, because then you're like, dude, he was like, granted, he wasn't like a super Nazi, but he's still a fucking Nazi. They're like, oh, he was a genius and war fan. It's like, no, man, he fucking sucked at attacking certain things. It's like, but Kai, like, circle back to that before I start ranting. It's just like this the mythology of these Christ-like figures, and like the mythology of like these great historical figures that did great things throughout history, that people think that, oh, they must have been, like I said, 3D chess, galaxy brained, 5 steps ahead. They're, just geniuses. No, they literally in the moment did things and probably took advantage of opportunities, and sometimes it's just sheer fucking dumb luck that shit happened. And to think that John Brown was a genius, no, like I'll go back and fucking say it again. Man was batshit insane. So Kai, the mythology of him, you're 100% correct. People who think that, these historians that go back and think that, like, oh, he's some sort of, genius. No, he's a regular guy that happened to be in the right place at the right time and had some good ideas and got people to follow him.
Yeah, it goes back to what y'all were saying about a cult-like figure. Like, there's been people who study him who now mythologize him in the same way people do Jesus. Like saying, Jesus had a grand plan that we're still trying to figure out or something. Similarly with World War II generals, it's just every time I talk to people who are obsessed over World War II, they do talk about these generals in such a way without considering any other variable that might go into a battle. It's nope, it was because Patton made the right call here. And yeah, so I completely 100% agree. And I think it's kind of, you're right. He was just a regular guy. I will say, I don't think he's as insane as people paint him out to be. I will say that though. And people said that about him. He was very upset about that too. And he would say the exact opposite.
He just pulls the joke. He's like, I'm not crazy. John Brown was the original Joker. There you go. That's what it is.
Geez, Nelson.
Oh God.
Chris, I do have a question because this has come up sometimes in the past when like I mostly from lost causes, but also from other people. Did you talked about Harriet Tubman, you talked about Frederick Douglass, like what were like some specific things did like I had heard before that like Harriet Tubman was like tried to was like really disagreed with like what John Brown wanted to do and wanted him to actually like help her, and John Brown was like, no, I want to do my Harper's Ferry raid, I want to do my own thing. So like was there like a disagreement between the three of them?
There was.
Like, I know you mentioned it in the episode, but like could you get a little bit more like, was there anything specifically that like they might have said that we know of that like Harriet Tubman was like, hey John, chill the fuck out and come help me with this. This is an established thing we're doing with Underground Railroad, etc. And John Brown was like, no, I want to go raid Harper's Ferry.
So
That's a very white man. I'm sorry, Chris, but that is a very white man thing to do. Please do go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was like, I'm doing my own thing. No, I will say this. Frederick Douglass did disagree with the plan and couldn't figure out what John Brown was doing and called him suicidal and said it was an awful idea and he wasn't coming along. And John Brown did try to recruit Frederick Douglass to his cause because he thought it would ignite abolitionists to rally around Frederick. By this time, Frederick Douglass's autobiography's out. He's world renowned. He's an orator. He's getting paid a lot of money doing speeches all around the country and Canada. Harriet Tubman, on the other hand, I haven't heard, and anyone listening can fact check this, that she vehemently disagreed with the plan. What I do know for sure is that Harriet Tubman helped John Brown recruit in Canada. So some of the people that raided Harper's Ferry with John Brown were actually people that Harriet Tubman hooked John Brown up with. She did not accompany him, probably because she was doing her own thing with the Underground Railroad, but she definitely supported him and would call him the general, apparently, to say things like that. So she did help him recruit in Canada for Harper's Ferry. Because Harriet Tubman's fascinating. A lot of people think of Harriet Tubman as only the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman fought in the Civil War, and she believed in using violence to end slavery as well.
And she led troops in the battle, right? Wasn't she like an officer?
Exactly.
Like she like led troops in the battle. That's something how I found that out? A fucking episode of Drunk History on
not
Comedy
my
Central. No, it was actually an episode of Drunk History on whoever hosted Drunk History. Then I heard it from you. But that was one of the things. Sometimes sometimes when people are like, I didn't learn that in history class, I was like, because I knew you in history class, you slept through history class. Like, I'm pretty sure I vividly remember certain pictures in the history book from, I was high school, 2005, 2009. I like remember this, and I loved history. Like, they talked about it, and I want to talk about it more, but nobody wants to talk about it. You just slept through history class. They did teach this in history. You just slept through it. But one of the things they did not teach, and I will hand to John Brown's God, right? They did not ever once mention that Harriet Tubman fought in the Civil War and led troops in the battle and did great things other than doing the Underground Railroad. In school, we're always taught that Harriet Tubman, Underground Railroad, and then it just kind of just like disappeared and faded into existence, right? Ascended into heaven 3 days later. But like the whole thing is like, I did not know until that Drunk History episode that Harriet Tubman fought with the Union Army. She led troops into battle and terrorized the Confederacy on that level, not just the Underground Railroad.
Oh yeah, she had a status of an officer in the Union Army because she knew the South so well inside and out. And so Harriet Tubman freed more people in the Civil War than in the Underground Railroad. And I think it's fascinating because I didn't learn that in high school and history either until I started teaching. I started looking into Harriet Tubman more. Even on the Underground Railroad, we don't teach it the way that it should be taught. It makes it seem like it just bounced around from house to house, and no, yeah, the Harriet Tubman.
It's like Lord of the Rings. They're just like bouncing around.
Yeah, that's how I was taught, and I felt like they just kind of were sneaking around at night. Harriet Tubman was armed. People had guns, and if you made the commitment to go with Harriet Tubman, you couldn't turn back because then you could jeopardize the entire process. So anyone that would thought about it, it was like, nope, if you make this journey, you go. If babies would cry, she would rub alcohol along their gums to get them to be quiet and stuff. Like the things Harriet Tubman did to make the Underground Railroad work, and then later what she did in the Civil War. I mean, there's a whole episode that could be done on that. I'm sure there's
we're gonna add it. They're gonna add it to the book. We're gonna come back. It's gonna be there's so many episode ideas. It's like, Chris would be great for this. But like touching on that real quick is that the fact that she was an officer in the Union Army is astounding, and people don't like the fact, one, being a woman, that's unheard of, that this did not happen still to this day in the U.S. military. But second, black men, when they were in the Union Army, could not rise past NCO, could not be hired, they could not be enlisted. They were stopped at sergeant. So the fact that she was an officer as a black woman goes to show like how important she was to the cause. And I think that, like I said, people need to learn about this and know that, it wasn't just her, one, the Underground Railroad being whitewashed, but two, the fact that no one really knows that she was an officer in the Union Army and wreaked havoc in the South is it's mind-boggling that that's not more out there, that you have to learn about it on a Drunk History episode and a TikTok.
You don't have to include my TikTok. It's
okay. Yeah, John Brown, interesting fellow. So, I like him. I think he's cool because he had a beard.
He's all right. No, I'm just kidding. One question I always ask my students, and I always find it interesting: what is the result of Americans, mostly white people, never hearing about somebody like John Brown? I always find it fascinating that the history we are taught, in many ways, doesn't include John Brown's. And I always wonder, what is the impact of people like John Brown being purposefully and intentionally left out of curricula across the country?
Well, I think that's really easy. I think that's a really easy answer, and that you're not changing the narrative of what white people are supposed to function as under the American system. Even if you even include revolutionaries in other countries, you might hear more about them if they're white, if they're their own nationality, their own race in those countries. But in the United States, it is so critical that the model of what a white citizen does not include something like revolution on the behalf of an enslaved race, of oppressed people, of people who are like poor people. Like it's so clearly the white American propaganda machine kind of, and that propaganda doesn't always necessarily mean that you're putting something out there. It can also mean taking that information back. That is just flat out for me. Anybody got something beyond that?
3 for 3.
No, yeah, like isolation and individualism is what, you're supposed to homogenize it like that. That's their whole point.
It is so much harder for somebody to start something out of whole cloth that kids learn by watching models. And into your adulthood, you still learn by watching models, by watching the model of this is what a revolutionary looks like. A revolutionary is somebody who fought in the American Revolutionary War. That is a revolutionary. A revolutionary does not include, for a white person who's on the right side of a revolution, does not include somebody like John Brown. It's clear as day for me. It's the reason why I don't remember being taught about him when I was in high school, and I was one of those history nerds who, even though it was the first class of the day, 7:15 in the morning, I remember all of it. So that's what I got.
What Kai said, what Mark said. I can't really add anything to that. That's perfect. I think that the only thing I would add from my personal perspective is because he, like, his dying words, he went against the system. Like, he went against he fought for the wrong class. That's basically it. It's just that if he would have even waited a year and or however, like, waited 1 or 2 years and joined the Union Army and became an officer in the Union Army, or even if he was a guerrilla fighter for one of the guerrilla units during the Civil War for the Union, he would be taught more than he is now. I think that because he did what he did at a certain time, and it was an act of quote unquote treason, quote unquote terrorism, he is looked upon as someone who did something that wasn't right back then. Even you could people argue about it now. So he's not taught because he was a renegade. And if he had stayed with the system and waited and done those things, he probably would be up there with Sherman and Grant and Hooker and what's his face, with the mustache, Chamberlain, right? But because he didn't and started things off a little bit too soon, he's vilified. So yeah,
I agree with y'all 100%. It's one of the reasons why I'm getting my PhD in curriculum development, because I am fascinated by who and what we pick for people to learn and understand. I cannot wrap my head around all of these historical figures that I keep to this day, keep coming across over and over and over. People leaving to fight in the Spanish Civil War, like these incredible stories that are not being taught. And in many ways, that impact is detrimental. And if they can stop all of this history from getting to students, which is what they're trying to do now, then they control the present and the future. And so I find that absolutely fascinating. I agree 100% what y'all are saying. I think if more students knew about these historical figures and knew stories and actual history, instead of just a whitewashed version of history, with maybe a few things sparkled in here and there, our entire country would be different. So I think John Brown, not only is it a fascinating historical story, I think it's a fascinating conversation about who we choose as a society to learn about and who we choose to try to bury and forget. And what's happening today is so many people are vying for history, like to control history classes. And so now to teach some of this history is almost, trying to think of the right word.
I mean, it's becoming illegal almost, like what we talked about in the episode we did with Lexi in Florida. Like, it's becoming illegal. It's becoming
criminalized.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I just posted last night The True History of the Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key, which is from a super racist poem. And someone took my tweet and they sent it to the Louisiana Department of Education. And I find that absolutely fascinating, because it's like there's an actual war right now on history teachers to bury this history. This was today. This was like right before I got on. I was like, oh, wow. Or a few hours ago. So in my mind, I don't want to sound too intense, but the fight that John Brown was waging, it's not over. And that's what I think is so important about these historical figures. Is the fights that they fought in many ways still exist in just various different forms and shapes. And people know that. And I think there's been a big push for people like John Brown and others to be in the curriculum. And I mean, as you said, people are dying for a podcast about John Brown. And the people in power, they know the power of this history. And so they desire to suppress it so much. That's why when you hit me up, I was like, of course, like any chance I get to talk about some type of history in this regard, absolutely. And so that's why John Brown's also so fascinating to me today.
Like
So what you're
I'm
sorry. Go ahead.
go ahead, Nelson. What joke?
No, I'm sorry. No, you're right. It was a stupid joke. God damn it.
I know your facial movements at this point. But I'm gonna make a serious point again because I'm the one that lives on here to bring everybody down. But I just like it's very important to bring this up is that it's kind of, even though white history is so overtaught, especially in the American system, that there's some bits of it being held back, that in a lot of ways you can ask racialized students about this to begin with. That me being a Native American woman, being Indigenous, and going into school and not being taught my own history, or being taught my own history in a very small sliver, and that it can only exist in this time period, and that nobody has any understanding before or afterwards, and how that shifts with movement, with settler movement across the continent and everything, that you leave Indigenous students like me woefully unprepared for dealing with that when you're in school. And you have other students who might not have a supplementary education about that from their own families, undereducated, going out into the population and somehow always finding me and asking me, I thought all Native Americans were dead. And then there's moments where I have in fact gone into schools and done supplementary education because I've had teachers say, like, look, we are only allowed to talk about Native American history from between 1850 and 1890 during westward expansion. Like, that's the only time that we really get to talk about it. And maybe like when the Pilgrims first set foot on the continent, basically. So they ask for people like me, like my mom. I'm fourth generation of doing educational supplementary education for people. Like, my family has done shows about it. I've gone into schools. It's something that we do. We're so used to picking up that slack and just trying to shove as much education in as we can in those moments. But as time has gone on, I've realized that there are so many more stories and more revolutionaries and people that I can look at. And like I was saying, like, kids learn through role models. You learn through watching somebody else. And by never seeing somebody who represented me in that education, it always felt cardboard. It always felt too far away. It's the way that you let history die, by not making it relate to how you are right now. So I was an adult when I learned about people like Lozen, and learned about the Pueblo revolts, and learned about exactly what Iroquois people called George Washington when he was leading raids in New York State. Like, there's so many things that I didn't learn, that history was being held back, was dying in a way that I could have confronted at the time as a young person, that I could have seen part of myself in that. And that's what essentially you're doing. I'm going to defend white students. Yes, I defend white students. You're doing this to white students as well, by not giving them that role model of, this is a person. You don't have to create the revolution out of whole cloth. This is somebody who's done it before. You can see what happened, what kind of echoes happened from that later on. And if anybody remembers, when we had Lexion, I ended up crying, just decrying what's happening to history education in schools in America. And I'm on the rage side. I'm on the rage side of talking about this. But yes, it is becoming criminalized, and we're doing kids such a disservice. And it's all in the name of American propaganda and the American mythology.
I mean, there's just so much that you said that sometimes I don't know where to touch on. You're exactly right. I mean,
4 out of 4.
I know. I mean, it's just people aren't reflected in the classroom, and that has detrimental effects. That hits people's identity, right? Even today, I'm teaching the 7 Years' War, and I struggle to find maps that adequately reflect where Indigenous nations actually, like the land that they actually occupy, to show my students. So what I have to do when I had a Promethean board is I would have a map, and I would have to take a marker, and I would have to draw the Iroquois territory, which was massive. And I would have to actually do these things because a lot of times those resources just don't exist for teachers, because we prioritize certain history over another. So you're exactly right. And I'm glad that you do talk to students. I'm sure they get a lot out of it. And my students are shocked when they learn about the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. You know, it was not a small event by any means. It was one of the largest indigenous revolts in colonial, you know. And so I try my best as a history teacher to bring so many of these stories in, because if you're not reflecting your students and they don't see themselves in the classroom, then not only are we doing them a disservice just in general, but we're actually causing detrimental harm. And I think sometimes history teachers might not realize that as much as they should.
I am now self-conscious of my facial expressions because Kai apparently can read my mind with her indigenous magic.
It's the magic Indian trope. It's always...
If it makes you feel better, I didn't know a joke was coming. I didn't know.
See, you don't have the magic, Chris. You don't have the magic.
You have to touch the ground, and you have to smell the wind, and you have to go, oh, I know his brain waves are rattling right now, and here comes the joke.
Mark and Kai, they got it in them. They can read my mind. It's fucking wild.
Like
I know when you're gonna do the little this.
Whoa!
Like the tone in your voice,
Damn
and start getting excited, and then the like little
Oh God, am I that predictable?
For anybody listening, he was doing the Italian fingers. That's what he was doing.
Oh my God.
Anyway,
the joke I was gonna say is that so basically what we're all saying is that our podcast is gonna fill the void that
That's why I'm here, Nelson. I have put up with so much bullshit that I am here to tell people what they haven't learned before.
With love and friendship.
God love you, Nelson.
That is awesome.
Oh man. Oh Jesus. Anyway, I want to make it clear that I like John Brown. I think that killing slave owners is great because I don't want anyone to take my words out of context when I think he's batshit crazy. I think what he did was great. He should have killed more. Lots more.
I think he did.
Literally flowed with blood. Kansas just should have been red.
I think he killed a lot more. I just think this is only what we know, because when you read about Bleeding Kansas, like people were getting killed all the time, and especially in the dead of night, it was like guerrilla warfare on both sides.
I don't want some shitty like person on Twitter being like, Nelson, predicted by the proletariat, doesn't think John Brown was good enough.
They're gonna say it about me. It's all right.
And I will be like John Brown, and I will strike them down.
We'll make a John Brown alt account and just go off on these people.
Send all your complaints to that account.
Yeah.
And Mark's gonna run it.
And it'll just be knife emojis as every reply.
Mark has
they have axes and other emojis.
There you go.
More accurate.
Mark has the best
swords.
one line. Mark has the best one line comebacks out of all of us. So Mark's gonna run that account and just destroy people.
It's just gonna be that Megamind meme where it says no bitches. Just over and over. It's like, oh yeah.
Oh man, Chris, thank you. Do you have anything else you want to? You have anything else you want to say about John Brown?
Complicated historical figure that needs to be understood more by the masses, because it's crucial. It's crucial that this history gets out there, that people know the sacrifices others made during these specific times. Because I never heard about John Brown in school. In fact, all the people we learned about are nothing like John Brown. They were the exact opposite. So, yeah, absolutely crucial that people get this history. But also, thanks for having me on. I mean, it's awesome to just come and chat, and
hell yeah,
especially about one of my favorite historical figures, as you know. So,
hell yeah. Well, always glad to have you on. Now, you've gotten more famous since the last time you were on.
No,
we talked about it a bit before we recorded, but since you have become a world-renowned figure, where can people find you online to get all this plethora of information that you have?
All fake news. I am not, but no. You can follow me on Twitter. I do post my thoughts, and so if you are interested, that's at Chris Dier, Dier. And my TikTok is the same handle, at Chris Dier, Dier. And my Instagram is at Chris Dier 3. Somebody already took the at Chris Dier and it's really upsetting to me.
Evil
So,
Chris Dier.
Yeah, you could also email me, christier3@gmail.com.
Hell yeah.
And yeah, I also have a book out called The 1868 St. Bernard Parish Massacre, published by the History Press. So if you want to learn about some Reconstruction history that has been completely buried, if people send me an email, I happily mail signed copies. And yeah, feel free.
I want a signed
Well,
copy.
Are you shocked by this? Yeah.
No, I want a
definitely...
I want a signed copy.
Of course.
To my paisan, Nelson.
Yeah.
But I'll definitely tag those links in the description. And definitely we'll have you back on. Obviously, there's a ton of stuff that I think we don't need to talk about. That your book, that may be a good episode. I think that'd be great because I hadn't heard of that one. I hadn't heard of that massacre. So yeah.
Well, yeah. I was raised in St. Bernard Parish my entire life, and I never heard of it. So it's actually a massacre that happened in my hometown that I didn't know about until I started teaching Louisiana history to 8th graders. And the exact place where I was teaching, I came across some federal documents that showed that there were disturbances that happened in the area. And then I started digging and trying to figure it out. And this massacre has been completely buried. There's a very few people that talk about it through oral history that I, had to reach out to or talk to. So talk about entire massacres that have been buried and not included in the curriculum. I mean, I don't want to go too far about the curriculum, but in Louisiana, and I'm sure it's similar in other states, I know it was Texas, if you were taking U.S. history, then the curriculum starts at 1877. So similar to what you were saying, Kai, like they start at 1877 and go forward. So they don't even learn Reconstruction, Civil War, any indigenous history, anything like that before 1877. That has since been revamped because teachers have been going, absolutely wild about this. And now it's different, but it just changed this year. So students across the country aren't even learning history before 1877, which is so, we won't have to get into all that. But yes, That's where you can find them.
Hell yeah. All right, y'all. Dixieland, the proletariat, we the South will rise again, but this time for the right reasons, those being worker-owned means of production, decolonization, and self-determination for all oppressed peoples. Make sure to click on our link tree in the show notes where you'll find all of our social media. We are coming to you from the birthplace of the civil rights movement, Montgomery, Alabama, as well as sweet Georgia and jolly old England. We also like to recognize we're recording on land that is occupied and rightfully belongs to the Muskogee and Creek Nation. As always, thank you, Chris, for coming back on for a second time. We got to do it again soon. Kai is in my head telling me to shut up. I can hear her in my brain right now, and I now have the urge. I have the urge.
God is speaking
to me right now. I need to go raid Harper's Ferry. So, Mark, take us away.
Mind your own biscuits, and life will be gravy.